This video is brought to you by Sailrite. In this video, we'll be showing you how to build a powerboat cover from beginning to end. Purchase the fabric and supplies from Sailrite, and you too can build one yourself following this step-by-step instructional video. We'll cover the steps in determining how much fabric is required, sewing the fabric together, patterning the fabric right on the boat, including how to make darts. Everything is shown in great detail to accomplish a professional fitting boat cover. Angela from the Sailrite Loft is going to show us how it's done. We first want to take a measurement at the stern at the highest point. On this boat, it's the stern rail here. We're measuring just the stern rail. Then we'll measure from that highest point down to the rub rail. Draw out on paper a rough sketch of the top portion of your powerboat. This boat measured 7 to 8 inches at the stern's highest point, and then from that point down to the rub rail we had 8.5 inches. We need to account for that 8.5 inches on both sides of our boat, so the total at the stern is 95 inches for this boat. Now we'll take a measurement across the windshield, and then from the peak of the windshield down to the rub rail again. Write down those measurements on your rough sketch. Ours is 109 here. At the widest point of the bow, we're measuring across there on the top of this rail, and then we'll measure down from the highest point, which is our rail in this situation, to the rub rail, and we'll write those measurements down as well. If you have a larger boat and you want to be more precise in your fabric requirements, you can take fabric width measurements down the length of your boat and then take length measurements at those points. Just be sure to measure over high points and to the rub rail at those points. Finally, we need a measurement from the bow rub rail all the way to the stern's rub rail. This measurement needs to account for any and all high points, so the tape measure is draped over those objects. For our boat, it measured 231 inches. We need to add about 5% to that for a safety factor. Now take the fabric's width you will be using and subtract 1 inch. Take your length measurement and divide it by that width measurement, and this equals the required number of fabric panels. Our figure is very close to using only 4 panels. I think we'll be okay with just 4 panels for this boat. Here are the 3 measurements we took across the width of the boat. Imagine the 4 panels of fabric draped over the boat from port to starboard. Using the width measurements, you can determine how long each panel will need to be. However, as a safety factor, those width measurements should have about 10% more fabric added. Since ours are very close in size, we will make all 4 panels 120 inches. Here's what they look like when they'll be sewn together. That's coming up next. Now all we need to do is cut those 4 panels out. We're going to use a Surelast material, and we're using a soapstone pencil and marking the fabric to the appropriate size. There's no reason to use a hot knife to seal the edge. We're just using scissors because later on we'll have to trim it to size. So we'll do this for all 4 panels. Now we need to sew those 4 panels together. Along the long edge we'll apply basting tape or seam stick so that we can baste the panels together prior to sewing, which makes it a lot easier to sew them together. Angela's taking the second panel and laying it on top of the first panel so that the outside surfaces are facing each other. This Surelast fabric has a right side and a wrong side. If you use a Sunbrella marine grade fabric, it does not have a right side or wrong side. Pull off the transfer paper, revealing the glue, and baste the edges together so they are flush all the way down the length of the fabric panels. Now we can take it over to the sewing machine, and we want to sew approximately a 1/2 inch from the raw edge of the fabric. We're using the Deluxe 5.5 inch magnetic guide here. It's similar to what a table saw fence would be to help guide our fabric and keep our stitch at the appropriate distance. We'll apply double-sided tape to one of the long edges of those panels so that we can now attach a third panel. And you want to do this all the way down the length of your fabric until all the panels are joined together. Since our panels are all the same length, we don't need to worry about centering. But if your panels were cut shorter to save on fabric, you need to make sure that you center each one of the panels. We've already created the 1/2 inch stitch from the raw edge of the fabric. Now we need to create a semi-flat felled seam. To do this, we'll unfold the fabric as seen here in this illustration and then sew an 1/8 inch from the folded edge. Here the 4 panels for our boat have been rolled nicely together, scrolled on each end to make it easier for sewing. And here Angela has unfolded the fabric and sewing approximately an 1/8 inch from the folded edge of the fabric. Notice that she pulls the fabric apart with her 2 hands as she comes up and sews it. Pulling apart the seam as we sew the top stitch will create a gorgeous and accurate semi-flat felled seam. The outside surface of the fabric is facing up, so we see only the second stitch, or what is called the top stitch. Before you start sewing your top stitch to complete the semi-flat felled seam, let's discuss the optimal side to sew the top stitch on each of the panel seams. To help prevent water from leaking into the seams, positioning the top stitch on either the right side of the seam or the left side will make a big difference. This illustration demonstrates the direction we believe the water will flow. We want the top stitch to be positioned above the flow of water. This, in effect, will create a shingle-type structure which will help keep water from wicking through the seam. To keep from getting confused, draw this out on paper, and don't be alarmed if you mess it up. It's true the water may leak through your seam a little bit more if you do, but it's not something you should tear apart and redo. For a tight-fitting cover, we recommend applying a double-sided tape around the rub rail. Here we're applying a strapping tape first, because if you apply the double-sided tape to the rub rail, you may never get it off. But if you apply this strapping tape all around the perimeter of your boat, then apply the double-sided tape on top of it, you'll easily be able to remove it in a few days. Where the strapping tape and the double-sided tape are being installed on the rub rail will not be the bottom edge of our cover. We'll actually be sewing on a skirt in a later step. We're now applying the seam stick double-sided tape or basting tape in place on top of the strapping tape. This is part number 129 for canvas. If you want a more secure hold, you may want to use a super seam stick, but it's a little bit expensive, so we recommend using the seam stick for canvas. Now lay the cover material that you sewed together on top of the boat. Do not remove the transfer paper on the double-sided tape yet. First, position the cover so that it's nice and even on all sides, and make sure the seams are running straight across from port to starboard. We will be creating pleats or darts in the fabric to get it to fit nicely, so Angela's just being sure that she has enough material for that as well. Here at the windshield, she'll be folding the material in like this. Once you're happy with the centering and you're happy with the seams running across, you can now peel off the transfer paper, revealing the glue, and start to baste the cover in place. You'll notice there's a couple inches of excess fabric coming under the rub rail. We'll be marking it right on the rub rail, so don't be alarmed if you're shorter than that. You just need enough that you can baste it around the perimeter on the rub rail. Pull out as many wrinkles as possible as you baste it. You'll have to do this a few times. Having a second helper will help greatly. We do not have a second helper here. We're showing you that you can do it by yourself if you choose. All four of our panels were 120 inches, and as you can see, we have plenty of excess fabric here on this side. Angela's pulling out as many wrinkles as possible and basting it to the rub rail via that double-sided tape. Again, if you have a second helper, this will go much quicker. As she bastes it, she will also create darts where she believes they will be placed. You can move these around later on, but there you can see she's created a dart to take up some of the excess fabric. As she moves up to the windshield, she'll create a dart there as well. These are not the final darts, these are just preliminary darts to get the cover to fit nicely. Remember, we talked about only creating 4 panels when we really needed 4.11 panels. And we're awful tight here, as you can see here at the bow, but we do have enough material, just as we predicted. We just need enough to cover the rub rail. The client we're building this cover for wanted a very tight fit, so Angela's being very diligent in making sure the cover will fit nice and tight. I don't necessarily recommend making it as tight as Angela is doing here because you may have troubles later on fastening it to the boat. But if you want a nice tight cover, this is the technique to follow. As we come to the starboard side, you'll notice the panel isn't really centered that well. On the port side, there was a lot of excess fabric. Does that matter? No, not really, because of the fact that we just need enough to cover the rub rail. It is amazing how nice you can make a cover with just darts. That's what Angela is doing here. She's determining where a dart will be placed. She's creating the dart and then tensioning the rest of the cover. This cover will be nice and snug, and it'll be beautiful. And there's really no patterning except for obviously the patterning we're doing now to the actual fabric. You'll notice as well that as Angela goes along and tensions the cover on the boat, that she sometimes has to pull it up and reapply it. By using the double-sided tape all around the rub rail, we actually can hold this entire cover in place. If it doesn't stick well, sometimes using the 129 for canvas doesn't stick as well to a sunbrella fabric, then you may want to opt for the super seam stick available from Sailrite. This boat has a ladder, and it's a little bit difficult to get this cover to fit nicely around the ladder. It has a lot of shape, so we'll be making a separate panel that will be sewn in place in a later step. Next, we'll be working on perfecting the darts, and in preparation for that, we're positioning pony clamps in locations where a dart will need to be created. So here Angela is repositioning the cover a little bit, and she'll work on the darts next, and she'll use those pony clamps to secure the dart in place. Angela's working here on the port side at the bow. She's positioning the fabric so that it's nice and snug all the way to the windshield here on the port side. When she's happy with that all the way to the windshield, she's going to move to the starboard side of the boat. So now she's on the starboard side. She's positioned the fabric there at the bow as we did on the opposite side, and now she works on the dart at the windshield here on the starboard side. Be patient with yourself and take your time and try to duplicate the other side in this process. So once we're done with this, the starboard side at the windshield, we're going to go over and duplicate it on the port side. The more time and effort you spend in getting a nice fit, the better the end result of your cover will be. Once you're happy with the dart and the way it makes the cover snug on the boat, you can grab hold of the dart near the peak and place a pony clamp. This will help to hold the dart right where you want it. The excess fabric will be taken up by the pony clamp. So make sure the pony clamp tip or end is positioned right at the fold of the dart. I think that dart will be very nice. Now let's look at the stern portion of the windshield. We need a dart there as well because there's a lot of excess fabric. So now we'll just create another dart there. It's coming down towards the stern portion of the boat from the peak of the windshield. When you're happy with the dart, take a pony clamp and take up the excess fabric, so it's acting as the seam would be that we'll be sewing in a later step. Pony clamps are great for creating darts. By utilizing pony clamps, you can take up that excess fabric, and you'll basically get to see what it will be like when the dart is actually sewn in. Alright, she looks good all the way from the bow at the windshield, and now we just need to work on the stern section at that rail, and the starboard side will almost be done. We're going to create a dart in the very corner of the boat back here to take up the excess fabric. Moving right along here at the stern, we're positioning the fabric and repositioning any darts to pull out the excess. We'll have to reposition that pony clamp to pull the excess fabric out. There we go. We're not going to do much patterning around the ladder. We're going to be creating a second panel that will be sewn in with more shape for the ladder. That'll be done in a later step. We've moved to the bow section, and here we need to create a small dart to take out the excess fabric. We're still working on the starboard side, and we'll follow that same procedure for the port side. We're not going to show all of this. Once you're happy with the way the cover is resting on the boat, with all the pleats intact, we can take a soapstone pencil or chalk and mark around the rub rail. We're marking right above the rub rail here, and carefully marking around the entire perimeter of the boat. At each pleat or dart, you will need to carefully mark the folds. Use your marking tool and follow the fold all the way to the peak of the dart on both sides. It is recommended that you use a marking tool that will come off later with soap and water or just water. So using the soapstone pencil is a good idea, or using chalk is a good idea. Using a pencil, you may see some of the pencil marks in a later step, and they're a little bit difficult to remove. So we do recommend buying a good fabric marking pencil or chalk from Sailrite. Angela was using a soapstone pencil, but she finds that the marking chalk for fabrics actually marks this shearlast fabric a little bit better. So she switched to the marking chalk, marking it in the same manner. At the fold of this pleat. Notice how she's making sure that the pleat is nice and tight as she marks the fabric. That's where the stitch will be created in a future step. And she went all the way to the peak. We'll do that at each one of the pleats. We're not going to show all of them. Continue marking around the boat right at the rub rail, and then when you get to each one of the pleats, follow that same procedure you just saw. We've placed a pleat there near the bow, and we're also going to place a pleat, very small one, further up towards the bow to take out the excess fabric. So this is a very small pleat, but it's necessary. And we'll follow that same procedure on the other side, trying to duplicate the same pleats in the same location. She's working out some wrinkles here and marking the fabric. Looks very nice. Since we're going to create a separate panel that will fit the ladder better, we will just continue the line at the rub rail going past the ladder and then continue it on the opposite side of the ladder in the same manner. All the pleats or darts are now marked, and it's marked around the rub rail. We'll now concentrate on chafe areas. It is very important to go around and feel for any kind of sharp object that may abrade through the fabric and mark those locations with the soapstone pencil or the chalk. So here Angela is going around the boat and feeling for anything that may possibly abrade through the fabric. This is especially important with Sunbrella fabric, as Sunbrella is a phenomenal fabric, but it's not very abrasion resistant. So we need to put patches on the inside of the cover at each one of those locations. So mark those locations well so you can put a patch on them. All the chafe areas are now marked. We can now start to remove the cover, but we still need to mark where the windshield is. So we're going to remove the cover here at the stern so we can climb into the boat and mark the location of the windshield so we can put a chafe resistant patch there as well. So here she's marking the windshield. She's pushed the fabric up to the windshield and marks it where it is located. We did not remove the pony clamps on each one of the darts. Now we'll take a ruler that's approximately 1 inch wide and mark a line directly under the line that we marked around the rub rail. So we're marking a line 1 inch approximately away from that line on the outside surface, all around the perimeter of the cover. As you reach each one of the pleats, be sure to mark underneath the pleat right to the folds of the pleat, because we will have to leave that excess fabric in at each one of those pleats or darts, and continue marking. After you've marked around the entire perimeter, we're going to use the Sailrite Edge hot knife and cut the fabric right on top of that line that we drew approximately 1 inch down from the rub rail line. She's approaching her first pleat, and watch what she does. She folds the pleat as though it were actually sewn in place and cuts right through it as it is folded. You'll also notice that we have a ruler underneath the fabric to help prevent damage to the tabletop from the hot knife. Do this all around the perimeter. We haven't really talked about it, but we sewed this whole cover with Tanara thread. Tanara thread's amazing. It really doesn't cut with a hot knife. That's why it's totally UV proof and basically chemical proof. If you try to cut it with a hot knife, it'll take a while to cut. So we cut it with scissors there. You could also sew this cover with a polyester thread as well. Polyester thread is not as UV proof, it's UV resistant, but in the tropics it won't last nearly as long as Tanara. Tanara is a lifetime guaranteed thread. Here we are coming to another pleat, and watch what she does here. Angela has removed the pony clamp where she needs to cut. She folds the pleat as it would be created if she sewed it in, and then determines where the cut line is on the underside of the fabric and cuts across the pleat, continuing around. Since she removed the pony clamp, she's going to try and install the pony clamp again so the lines are directly on top of each other. And then she'll move on and continue to cut. Moving ahead, let's go to the next pleat, which is a rather small pleat. And here you can see one of the lines goes down at an angle and then comes across, and the pleat's intact. It's a very small pleat, I believe at the bow. And here's another pleat that has not been pony clamped. So she's going to create the pleat by pinching it together at the lines, fold it, and then cut through it. We'll do that all around the perimeter. We are now ready to sew the pleats or darts in place. To do this, we must transfer the marks that were placed on the outside of the cover to the inside or wrong side of the cover. So fold the fabric back to the lines you marked on the fabric and use a pencil to mark the fabric on the underside of the cover. It's those new lines that will be used as a guide for our stitching. The peak of the dart must be found, and once it's found, mark it with a pencil. Here Angela's found it. For this small dart, Angela's not going to strike a line on the underside of the fabric, though we do recommend that for amateur sewers. She's going to find the peak, which she's already done, and then she's going to place the fabric on top of the lines that she drew on the outside, and then she's going to mark it here near the bottom edge. Then she'll take it to the sewing machine and just sew from the peak to that mark. Now she'll take it to the sewing machine and sew the pleat in place. It is very important to do some reverse stitching to lock your stitch in place at each one of the pleats. So there at the top, we didn't really show it, but she did quite a bit of reversing. And here at the bottom, it's also a good idea to reverse several times. That pleat is now secured. If you're curious about the circle at the peak of that pleat, that's for a chafe-resistant patch. Let's show another technique for finding the peak. This is another small dart, and we'll just place a straight pin right through the peak. That way we can just mark it on the underside. This is an easy way to identify where the peak of a dart is. Okay, we showed sewing the darts in place for a very small dart, but what about the larger pleats at the windshield? Well, we don't want to miss anything, so let's show that as well. We've removed the pony clamps on this larger dart, and now we need to fold the fabric in so the lines are directly opposite of each other. It is important to take your time and line up the marks, and then we'll replace the pony clamp not on the outside of the fabric but on the inside instead. So we'll do that for each one of these pleats, and then we'll take it over to the sewing machine and sew it. So once she's happy, she's going to replace the pony clamp on the underside of the fabric. After the pony clamp is replaced on the fabric, you need to check your work, and then you'll repeat this down the entire length of this larger pleat. As you match up the lines, you need to make sure that the fabric lays as flat as possible when you replace the pony clamp on the underside of the fabric. When you approach the bottom edge where the rub rail was marked, don't get confused with the lines that indicate where the rub rail and the cut line was placed. Be sure to line up the dart lines. Now find the peak of the dart and mark that location. We're still working with this one large dart. You can see a second large dart off to the right. It's the one with the pony clamps on the outside of the fabric. We have yet to work on that, so don't get confused. We're working with the one dart that we placed the pony clamps on the underside of the fabric. Now lay the fabric as flat as possible and use your pencil and mark the fabric from the peak location to the first pony clamp location. It's not a bad idea to check to be sure the lines are in the correct location as you mark the fabric. Continue marking the fabric to the next pony clamp. As you can see, Angela is putting dashed lines instead of a straight line. She finds that a little bit easier. Check your work, mark the fabric. Check your work, mark the fabric. It's a time-consuming process, but the more time you spend doing this, the better the results. Always make sure that the fabric is laying flat as you mark it and as you move down the length of the dart. Once you're happy with the marks, if you've made dash marks, you can now match up each one of the dash marks with a straight line. Now we can take this larger dart to the sewing machine. We'll leave the pony clamps in place until we approach them as we sew. We started here at the bottom edge, did some reversing, and as we approach the pony clamp, we'll remove them. Keep them in place until you approach them with the sewing machine. Notice that as she feeds, she ensures that the fabric is laying flat. and that the lines are lined up on the underside or the correct side of the fabric. She removes the pony clamp and continues to sew. Needle is buried when she stops so she doesn't lose her position. She repositions the fabric for about 2 foot and sews to the next pony clamp, keeping everything nice and flat. She'll remove the pony clamp, hold her fingers in place so the lines stay on top of each other. She'll check the lines to be sure that she's happy and continue. And then when you finally get to the end, do some reversing. This is at the peak of that dart. Now that we're done, let's take a look at it and make sure that it looks good. If it doesn't, we'll have to rip up the stitches and redo it. Nope, she looks great. You should follow that same procedure for each one of the darts. In a later step, we'll be sewing a top stitch to each one of these darts, but before we do that, we want to take the cover to the boat and see how it fits. We've placed this cover on the boat and are using pony clamps to hold it in place, and we're checking to make sure that the bottom edge that we cut is covering the rub rail. Looks like it is, and we're checking to make sure that each one of the darts looks good. If it isn't, we can redo it before we create the top stitch. If everything looks good and it looks like it will fit, and this is a tight fitting cover, so we expected it to be pulled very tightly. If you're happy with it, you can remove it and we'll finish off the darts. Any of the large darts should really be cut. There's no need to have all the excess fabric in a large dart. So here we're cutting the fabric approximately 1 inch from the stitch. Doesn't have to be precise. And remember, we're using Tanara thread, so it does not cut well with a hot knife. We have to use scissors for that. A small dart does not have to have the excess fabric cut away. Alright, now we just need to create a top stitch at each one of the darts. Here's a small dart, and we fold the fabric back so that we can create a top stitch through the fabric that's folded back on the underside. We'll do some reversing at the beginning or the edge of the fabric and sew all the way up to the peak of this dart, keeping our stitch approximately 1/8 inch from the fold or from the seamed area. Pull the fabric apart as you sew so that the seam is exposed fully. Don't pull too tight, just enough to pull it apart. Do some reversing there, and that dart is now complete. Here's what it looks like on the underside. Now we need to do that for each one of the darts, whether they be small or large. This reinforces the dart and makes it look great. Here's another small dart at the bow, and you'll notice that there is a patch on the front of the cover right at the bow. That makes it easy to identify the front side of the cover or the front of the cover. We did not show that yet, but we'll be showing how to install that in the next chapter.
Show the underside on that one. Actually, show underside on both of them at the same time if you can.
We don't want to be remiss of a larger dart, so here Angela has found the darts at the peak of the windshield. She's determining which way she wants the fabric to lay on the underside, and then she'll take it to the sewing machine and sew her top stitch over top of those large darts. Same procedure, just a larger dart. So she folds the fabric back, and she's decided to place the fabric facing to the bottom of the screen and sew her stitch approximately 1/8 inch from the first stitch, pulling the fabric apart gently as she sews. We'll do that for each one of the darts. We will not show more of this. As we mentioned earlier, we're going to place a patch at the very bow point of the cover. This makes it easy to identify the bow and also gives it a little bit more reinforcing. So here we're taking some scrap fabric and cutting it to the size and shape that we desire for our patch. Just creating an arch here. We'll cut it out with scissors because we are going to create a single hem around the perimeter of the patch. Fits nicely. We'll take our double-sided tape on the underside of the Surelast fabric. The underside has a polyurethane coating. And we'll create our single hem, approximately a 1/2 inch hem. Could be a 1/4 inch as well. Once we're happy with that, we'll reapply the double-sided tape on the underside so that we can baste it to the cover. Peel off the transfer paper, revealing the glue, and baste it to the front of this cover. Then we'll sew it in place. We're sewing about an 1/8 inch away from the hem. You do not need to sew the edges as they will be sewn down in a later step. Now's the time to reinforce all the chafe prone areas with the Shelter-Rite tape patch. Here, this is a Shelter-Rite material that's 3 inches wide, and we're applying double-sided tape to the bottom side of it and applying it in the locations where we believe that the cover is prone to have some abrasion areas. The outside of the fabric has been marked with the chalk, and here Angela is marking the underside of the fabric so she knows where to position that patch. Once that's marked, she'll baste the patch to the underside of the cover and then take it to the sewing machine and sew around its perimeter. Using the double-sided tape ensures that the abrasion-resistant patch, the Shelter-Rite tape, will not move. If you don't use Shelter-Rite tape, you could use Naugahyde, or you could just use another layer of the same fabric that you used for the cover, though we recommend using a vinyl patch because vinyl tends to have a great abrasion-resistant characteristic. For any areas of the cover that have shape, we want to show how to build a abrasion-resistant patch for those areas. Like here at the top of this dart, we believe this is an area on our boat where it may abrade, so we're cutting a round patch out of the Shelter-Rite tape. We cut a slit halfway up into it so that we can create some shape to this patch. And then we'll position the patch on the back side of the fabric and determine whether or not this is the correct shape. So Angela's going to try to fit that patch to the shape of the cover. Once she's happy with it, she's going to sew that slit closed with the appropriate overlap for the shape of the cover. And then she'll baste it onto the cover and sew around its perimeter as well. This is a great way to create a patch for an area of the cover that has a lot of shape built into it. Let's discuss the many merits to using seam stick. Not only is it great for holding seams, hems, and patches in place prior to sewing, but it's also good for helping to prevent water leaking into the needle holes, because when it's exposed to the sun, it expands slightly and helps to fill the needle holes. Notice that as she sews around the patch, anytime she makes large adjustments to the fabric, she buries her needles. That way she doesn't lose the position she stopped in. There it is, sewing on. For the top of the windshield, we're going to fold the material back to where that windshield location is. Then we'll cut some Shelter-Rite tape to the appropriate length. Here we believe that we need more than a 3-inch area to be covered, so we're going to make 2 strips of the Shelter-Rite tape so that we can sew that together to make approximately a 6-inch strip of chafe protection patch. And you notice that we did make the length of the Shelter-Rite tape longer than the actual top, so it'll actually go over onto the sides. We're going to sew the 2 halves of the 3-inch Shelter-Rite tape together, and then we'll take it over to the cover and baste it in place and sew it onto the cover. And the 2 ends will actually come down the sides of the cover. We'll show that next. Before we do that, we need to transfer that line that we have on the outside of the cover to the underside of the cover. So that's what she's doing here with the chalk. She'll then strike a line matching up each one of those marks. And we'll apply the double-sided tape to that Shelter-Rite tape patch. Peel off the transfer paper, revealing the glue, and baste it in place right over top of that line. The chafe-resistant patch is long enough to go past the corner of where the windshield will be positioned, so it'll reinforce the sharp edges of the windshield. Because there's shape at that corner, we're going to have to make some relief cuts into the Shelterite reinforcing patch. So Angela's going to cut a slit almost to the middle on each side where there's excess fabric so that it can be relieved and lay nice and take the shape of the actual cover. That's about perfect. Now we have the corner of the windshield protected so that it will not abrade through the cover. Now we'll just simply sew the two long edges all the way down the length of the cover from port to starboard. There's no reason to sew the short ends. All it's meant to do is just be held in place. And that's all there is to Chafe protection. Here's what it looks like when we're done. Here's the outside surface, and here's the corner. Earlier on, we talked about creating a pattern or a separate panel for the ladder. You may be able to incorporate this in your original cover, but if you want a better fitting cover, you may want to consider doing this. Here Angela is placing the strapping tape on the parts of the ladder where she believes the double-sided tape should be placed so that she can create a pattern easily. We're showing this in double time, obviously. In order to create a form-fitting cover, you need to first create a frame structure for the fabric to rest upon. So place the strapping tape in locations where you believe you will need to create a panel of fabric that will be sewn into the cover. For this ladder, we're going to make 3 separate panels that will be sewn together to form the ladder cover. So Angela is placing the strapping tape at locations where she wants each of the 3 panels to end. Please notice that as she's placing the strapping tape in place, she's also applying the double-sided tape directly on top of it. So here she had to peel back the double-sided tape to get the strapping tape underneath that double-sided tape. So there are our 3 panels, 2 on the side and 1 on the top. She'll finish up by just placing the double-sided tape on top of the strapping tape. And now we can get ready for patterning. Peel the transfer tape off of the double-sided tape, revealing the glue. And now we'll take some scrap fabric and lay it on those 3 areas until we're happy with the shape. Baste it in place so that it's nice and tight. We're going to show this in double time as well, and we're also going to mark around it right on top of that strapping tape or where we believe the cover should be cut to size. You need to make sure that the marks are going to be directly on top of the other panel's marks. We'll be showing that as well. For this bottom edge, we want to mark it right where we marked the rub rail when we did the preliminary cover. So we'll be adding more fabric, an inch of fabric underneath this line in a later step. And we're marking here where we want that second panel, the side panel, to be joined to this, the top panel. Okay, so be sure you remember where you marked it on the frame so that when you remove this cover, you can put the line on the side panels in the same location. Here she marked it top so she can tell what the top side is and what the bottom side is. Always a good idea to label panels that may become confusing in a later step. And she'll mark it right there where that tape is. She'll remove the cover and yet cut off the excess material at the bottom, leaving at least an inch because we need to add a skirt in a later step. And so we need some seam allowance. We'll remove that panel and now we'll work on the side panels using some scrap fabric. Same procedure. Okay, as you mark the fabric, be sure to place the mark right where you placed the mark on the first panel, because you want these to be basically directly on top of each other. First panel's gone, but Angela's trying to remember exactly where she placed that mark along that rail. It's also a good idea to label this as well so you don't get confused. She labeled it left. And now she'll do the same thing on the right side. We're not going to show this. All three of those panels we patterned for the ladder have been removed, and now we're adding a 1/2 inch around the perimeter of every side that needs to be sewn together. On the bottom where the rub rail is, we need to add 1 inch there. You can pretty much guess here because where the fabric will be sewn together, we are going to be creating a semi-flat felled seam, so the excess fabric will just be laying underneath the cover. Along the bottom edge, we need to add 1 inch underneath that line that we drew for the rub rail because we'll be adding the skirt at that location later on. So we'll do that to all three patterns and we'll cut them out with a hot knife. This is the Sailrite Edge hot knife. Great hot knife at a reasonable price. You need to orient each one of the panels correctly. So here Angela's thinking about it, making sure that that's how they need to be oriented, and this is it. She'll take that side panel and lay it on top of the top panel so the outside surfaces are facing each other. Then she'll create a stitch a 1/2 inch or right over that line that she drew on the fabric. Do a little bit of reversing at the beginning. She's checking the lines underneath to make sure that she's sewing directly on top of the lines. And notice what she does when she gets to the corner of this assembly. She'll kind of walk it slowly to create a nice gradual corner, being sure the outside edges are lined up as she sews. So here she's coming up to that rounded corner. She's trying to keep her stitch on top of the chalk line underneath because that's our guide. She'll leave her needle in the fabric, check her lines, and start to pull the top fabric over so that it's lining up with the lines on the underside. She's really not using the outside edge, she's using the lines as a reference here. Do a little bit of reversing at the end, and here's what it looks like when it's turned right side out. We still need to create a top stitch, but we'll do that after the third panel is installed to this. When we sewed panel 1 and 2 together, we had the side panel on top. Here we're going to have the top panel on top and the side panel underneath. Same procedure. Outside surfaces are facing each other, and we'll just follow that chalk line on the underside, which is approximately a 1/2 inch from the raw edge of the fabric. So now we're going to pay attention to the fabric underneath and follow its edge. Let's move on. Here's what it looks like when it's done. And now we'll create the top stitch for both those seams we just created. So we'll fold the fabric on the underside. We're going to fold it down towards the bottom of your screen, and we'll place a top stitch an 1/8 inch from the seam, pulling the seam apart gently as we sew, just as we did with anything else on this cover. Now let's show the corner, because the corner, it seems like there's a lot of bulk fabric, but it's pretty easy to go past that. So watch what Angela does here. Alright, she just is entering the corner or the bulk of the form. She sews right through that, pulling carefully. Take your time, and that's all there is to it. We're not going to show sewing the second top stitch. Here it is, finished. Unfortunately, we had to put the cover on, at least the stern section of the cover, and we basted it around the perimeter of the rub rail, and we're going to now fit the ladder cover in place so we know where to sew it onto the main cover. Angela's going to cut some relief slits in this cover. Obviously, we don't need to worry about this fabric here. Don't cut past any of your masking tape, especially on the outer edges, but you do need to cut some relief out here so the cover can relax around the ladder. So here, the side panel will allow us to make another slit there because we do have a side panel to cover that portion, so we can actually let the portion of the ladder kind of just hang out of the cover. We still have plenty of material to work with. We just do not want to cut past any one of those strapping tape positions. And she's carefully basting the cover onto the strapping tape, or the double-sided tape I should say, on top of the strapping tape. Then she'll mark a new position for the rub rail because we pulled out a lot of excess fabric there, so don't follow your old line at the rub rail, create a new one. And now we'll follow that masking tape, or strapping tape I should call it, because that's where the new cover was created. So we're trying to mark on the same location where the ladder cover was made. She's made a little dash mark there to indicate that's where the tape is, and she'll match up those lines in a later step. She's trying to pull the cover as tightly as possible and then position or mark the fabric on top of the strapping tape. There we go, marked all the way down to the rub rail, or our new rub rail line, I should say. She's checking to make sure it's correct, and yes, I believe she's happy. Now she'll do the rest. Once she has the cover marked where she's going to create her stitch, she will now mark on the outside of that line approximately a 1/2 inch out, because that will be her cut line. She needs some allowance for seam allowance. We're going to be creating a semi-flat filled seam here as well. She's marking more than a 1/2 inch, and that's quite all right, but that'll be where she cuts the fabric. She's going to go ahead and cut the fabric while it's still on the boat, and then she'll check to make sure that her lines are right where she wants them, and it looks like they are. She's folded back the material to indicate where it will be folded. Looks good. So now I believe we're ready to install the cover for the ladder onto the main cover. Oh, she also marks where the middle of the rail is on both sides, so she knows where the seam should actually fall. Okay, she places the cover so the right sides or outsides are facing each other, and she'll start from one side and sew all the way to the other corner, right on top of the lines that she created underneath the fabric, which in this situation are about 1 inch apart. They're 1 inch away from the raw edge. Usually they're just a 1/2 inch. You want to follow the chalk lines, not necessarily the 1/2 inch rule, because the chalk lines are our guide. The ladder cover is now installed to the main cover. Now we just need to create a semi-flat filled seam or top stitch. She's going to do that next. She'll fold the fabric back the way it wants to fold here, which is on the outside here, and she'll sew 1/8 inch away from that stitch line, just as we did previously with anything else. Since we've shown this many times before, we're going to skip ahead. But we do want to show you what it looks like when we're done. Here it is done. Beautiful. It is always recommended that a few vents be installed in a cover that encloses a boat, even if you use a breathable fabric. We're going to place 3 vents in our cover. The vent opening will be about 6 inches square. Sailrite does sell a vent cover if you prefer a prefabricated vent that you can just sew in place. Or, if you'd like, you can make your own, and that's what we're going to do here. We've cut out the vent opening with the Sailrite Edge hot knife, and you will notice that we're using a metal ruler on the bottom side to prevent damage to the tabletop below. Now we're going to use a Fibertex mesh. This is a vinyl mesh material. We've cut it larger than the 6-inch square, and we placed double-sided tape around the entire perimeter of our Fibertex mesh material. We'll lay the fabric so that we're working from the bottom side, because we want our mesh to be installed on the inside of the cover. Baste it in place. We'll take a final measurement of our cutout, which is about 6 inches, and we need to cut some excess fabric that will create the vent fly. So we're going to make that approximately 9 to 10 inches long. We want to make sure that it's plenty large. So here we folded some fabric, scrap fabric, in half. This is the same fabric we made the cover out of. And now we'll use our marking pencil. This situation we're using the marking chalk, and we'll create a slightly triangular shaped cover that's 10 inches by 8 inches by 7 inches. Something that'll look nice on top of the vent opening. And we'll cut it out with scissors. The size is not that crucial. We just want it big enough that it's going to cover our opening nicely and create a nice vent opening so it'll rest above the Fifertex mesh opening. Now we'll place double-sided tape around the entire perimeter. We'll peel off the transfer paper, revealing the glue, and baste a 1/4 inch hem. Once that's done, we'll apply double-sided tape on top of that hem on one side only. Then we'll baste it in half. So it creates a 2-layer vent cover. Sticky, but nice. Next, we'll sew the long edge down at the bottom because we will not be able to sew this once it's installed to the cover. We did some reversing at the beginning to lock our stitch in place, and we'll do some reversing here at this corner as well. Now we can take it over to the cover and sew the rest of it in place. We're going to first apply double-sided tape to the angle sides and the top side. Now we can baste it in place until we're happy with the way it rests on the cover. We obviously want the bottom to be open, like a dryer vent cover would be on the outside of your home. Baste it in place at the top and along the sides. We want to push the sides of the vent fly over so that it's approximately a 1/2 inch from the cut square underneath. Doing this will sew both the vent fly, the cover, and the Fifertex mesh material underneath all at the same time. Now, we did not sew the bottom edge of the Fifertex. We could do that in advance. Angela forgot to do it here, so she will do that in the final step. Now she's happy with the placement. She'll sew around the perimeter of the vent, leaving the bottom edge open. Oh, here she's sewing the bottom edge of the Fifertex in place, since we can't sew the vent cover down to that. Now she can rebaste the vent fly in position and sew its angled sides and the top side. When you're sewing the sides and the top, just be sure that you're sewing through the Fifertex underneath at the same time. Otherwise, the Fifertex does nothing. You could use a different material rather than Fifertex. Sailrite sells a fiberglass mesh as well. The location of each vent is totally up to you. Typically, you'd put one at the stern because you want the air to flow through if there's air that gets underneath the cover as you're trailering it, and some on the side someplace. The cover's just about done. We just have to create a skirt around the entire perimeter of the boat. We're measuring from the top of the rub rail and including a 1/2 inch for seam allowance. So we want our finished facing to be about 7.5 inches for our boat, because that is where the snap is installed. It'll give us a good tight fit. Now we're going to measure around the entire perimeter of the rub rail. We have about 47 feet. Instead of making one skirt that's 47 feet, we're going to make two that can be joined together at the stern. Divide your measurement around the boat by 2 and then add some extra, about 2 feet or so. So 47 feet divided by 2 is 23.5 plus about 2 feet. Let's make ours 25 feet. We'll make 2 strips that are 25 feet. We want our strip to be about 7.5 inch finish, so we're going to make strips that are 15 inches because we want to fold it in half. So this is a 15-inch strip, and we would fold it in half when we're done. We're going to cut it across the width of the fabric so we can save on fabric. We're going to join several strips together to equal our 25 feet. So we want to place the outside surfaces so they are facing each other. Then we want to sew along the short edge of those panels, a 1/2 inch from the edge, joining them together, and then we'll create the semi-flat filled seam. So we'll create a top stitch just as we've done anywhere else in the video. The fabric we're using is 60 inches wide, We need 25 feet of this, so we'll get about 59 inches once this semi-flat filled seam is created, meaning we need about 5 panels per side. We're not going to show sewing all of these 5 panels together plus another 5 panels together to make our 25 foot strips for each side. Once we're done, we'll fold the material at the end approximately 1.5 inches over it and create a double hem. This is a 1.5 inch double hem, and we folded the material back towards the underside of the fabric. This is the underside of the fabric. And now Angela will create several stitches just to give it a nice finished and hefty look. This will be at the bow of the boat. And this assembly will be folded in half, and we'll create a stitch about 2 inches from the raw edge of the fabric. This is not the folded side. So Angela's positioning the fabric, and then she'll use that deluxe 5.5 inch magnetic guide and use that as a guide to keep the stitch in the same spot. And she'll sew down the entire length. For ours, it's 25 feet, all the way down, holding the raw edges of the fabric so they are even. Obviously, the length and the width of your skirt may be completely different. Once you've gone down the entire length, we need to place a second stitch a 1/2 inch further in. So this is a second stitch approximately a 1/2 inch from the first stitch we just created. Even though the length and the width of your skirt may be different, these stitches still go in the same spot, 2 inches from the edge and a 1/2 inch from the other. Once you're done with that, let's go to that end where we reinforced it and close that up with a single stitch, reversing at the beginning and also at the bottom edge of this. Once we're done with this 125 foot strip for our boat, we need to make another one exactly the same. We're not going to show that. Now we'll sew this strip starting at the bow, right there where that bow patch was put on, and we'll sew it so that it's about a 1/2 inch, the stitch is about a 1/2 inch from the raw edge of the fabric. And we'll sew the strip on so that its raw edge matches the raw edge of the cover. Be sure to sew it on to the top side of the fabric. The outside surface of the actual cover is facing up. It doesn't matter which way the skirt strip goes as long as you have that reinforcing double fold at the bow. Now, this is a good time to actually stop and think. You may want to install the webbing onto the facing strip prior to installing it on the cover. We did not do that, but that may be something you want to do first because you'll have less material to fight with. Here we are at the stern already. We kind of skipped ahead, and the vent you can see is installed right at the stern. You'll want to stop short of that middle position by at least 5 inches or so. And now let's move to the bow and install the second skirt strip. We've laid that second skirt on top of the first one we sewed on by approximately 1.5 inches, and we start sewing. The cover's on the top and the skirt is on the bottom this time. We're looking at the underside of the main cover. The skirt is underneath. And sew around the perimeter with this until you get to the stern. As mentioned previously, you may want to install the webbing with the leech line prior to installing the facing to the cover. Here we are at the stern, and we stopped 5 inches or so from the center position. And as you can see, we have plenty of material. We calculated for at least 2 feet extra on each skirt. We want to determine exactly where the stitch should go to join the skirts together. So she's using her fingers here to determine where the stitch should be, and she'll hold it in position as she takes it to the sewing machine and sews it at that location. Now let's check to make sure the skirt fits perfectly at the stern location, and it does. We'll cut off the excess fabric about a 1/2 inch from the stitch, and then we'll create a top stitch, just as we did with anything else. And remember, Tanara doesn't cut well with a hot knife, so we have to use scissors for that. Now we finish the skirt with a top stitch at the junction point. After the top stitch is done, we'll sew the remainder of the skirt to the main cover, which is only about a foot or so. Now around the entire perimeter, Again, we'll create a top stitch securing the skirt in place. So Angela feeds the material back into the sewing machine. She's ensuring that their fold on the underside is folded so that she sews through it. She starts here at the bow, does some reversing, and she'll sew all around the cover, ensuring that she's sewing through that 1/2 inch lip on the underside. This stitch is approximately an 1/8 inch from the fold. Notice she's pulling her fabric or her seam apart as she sews. Here we are coming to the bow yet again. Do some reversing there. Now the skirt is sewn on completely to the cover. We'll next concentrate on the webbing and the leech line along the bottom edge of the skirt. Sailrite suggests using a 2-inch webbing, whether it be polyester, nylon, or polypropylene. The webbing will not be exposed to the sun, so you could get away with using a polypropylene webbing. And we've positioned the magnetic guide there so that we can sew approximately 1/4 inch from the edge of the webbing and also the bottom edge of the cover. So Angela's being careful here to match up the webbing with the bottom edge of the cover so it's not exposed, and she'll sew a straight stitch all the way around the length of the cover. And when she gets to the other end, she'll use a hot knife and cut the webbing so that it does not unravel. 2 good reasons to use a webbing at the edge of the skirt. 1, it will make a sleeve for the leech line, and 2, it'll reinforce any fastener installations. Alright, we need to create one more stitch to secure the webbing, but while we're doing that, we want to install the leech line around the perimeter so we can tighten up the cover even after it's snapped. We're using an 1/8 inch leech line and placing it inside of the webbing, and then we'll sew the inside edge of the webbing in place. So this leech line goes around the entire perimeter of our cover. Be sure to leave at least 2 or 3 feet hanging out the end, and feed the leech line in as you sew around the entire perimeter. We will not show this whole process. Here we are coming to the end, and you'll notice that we have some leech line sticking out there. We want to leave about 2 to 3 feet there as well. And that's all there is to it. Now we're going to put the cover back on the boat, but first we need to remove the strapping tape and the double-sided tape. To install snaps, first we need to place the cover on the boat, and we're going to use that drawstring that we installed in a sleeve and tension it very tightly around the boat. This will help us to position the snaps at the appropriate spot. Be sure the cover is resting exactly where you want it before you install any snaps. There are multiple ways to install snaps. We're going to use Sailrite's SnapRite system to install these snaps. We've placed a socket on the socket die, and we'll place a SnapRite button in the button die. We're going to use a rivet tool to install these snaps. Brian has snapped the SnapRite socket die onto the existing stud that is installed on his boat. Then he pushes the stainless steel mandrel through the fabric and the webbing underneath. Take the riveting tool with the SnapRite button in the die and push it over the mandrel. Then depress the lever of the tool a few times until you reach a firm, hard feeling. Then remove the tool and check the snap to see if it's firmly set in place. The mandrel does not necessarily need to break to set the snap appropriately, and the mandrels may be used up to 3 times before they need to be discarded. By using the SnapRite system, we can position each one of these snaps exactly how we want it, right where we want it on the fabric. And we can draw the fabric very tight and then push the mandrel through. Here we're getting ready to install another snap on the opposite side of the boat. So we're working from one side to the opposite so that we make sure that the cover fits nicely. And we'll pull the fabric very taut and push the mandrel through. We're not going to show setting this snap all the way. After that snap is installed, we'll move to the other side of the boat, and then we'll position a snap right next to that first one we installed. So the SnapRite system is excellent not only to draw your fabric tight, but also as a positioning tool to determine the distance that it needs to be spaced between other snaps. For your information, we are using a hard action socket. We believe a hard action socket is best for a cover that is made so tight. If you use a normal action socket, they would unsnap a little bit easier. We will continue to work around the boat, installing the snaps in the appropriate position to make the cover nice and snug. Our cover utilizes a rope and a sleeve at the bottom edge of the skirt, and the placement of the snaps above or below the rope is up to you. At the bow, we found that the shape of the hull seems to cause the rope and the sleeve to rest towards the outer edge of the cover, so we will install snaps above the rope there. However, when the hull is more vertical, the rope seems to want to rest in towards the inside of the sleeve, so we will install snaps below the rope there. You'll notice here that Brian repositioned the mandrel. He didn't like its location. That's one of the beauties of using the SnapRite system. If you don't like it, you can reposition the mandrel. Then when you're happy, install the snap. Let's discuss one common issue that is so easily resolved it may seem silly. Sometimes the rivet tool will not release the mandrel and seem stuck, but if you just lift the handle on the tool, it quickly releases the mandrel. Problem solved. At the transom, we sewed on webbing loops and will attach snaps to those webbing loops. This will help hold the cover on in areas where there are obstacles like the ladder and where the cover cannot come up against the hull of the boat. Yes, this cover is very tight, but we're still going to install support poles to keep water from pooling in the center.
Okay, whenever you're ready. Right there.
Brian has crawled inside the cover and is holding a support pole up. Angela marks it with the chalk right where he wants it located. At each location for a support pole, we need to install patches for reinforcing and also fasteners for the support pole itself. Using some of the same material that the cover was made from, we're marking and cutting out patches that are approximately 6 inches by 6 inches. We need 3 of them. And now we're applying double-sided tape to all 3 of them. We'll base the first 2 together. These 2 will go on the underside of the cover. We'll peel off the transfer paper, revealing the double-sided tape. Here's the location we want to install the patch for our support pole, and Angela has placed a pin through the fabric so she can determine where it is on the underside of the cover. She'll now base this 2-layer assembly to the bottom side of the cover directly over the patch so that it's perpendicular with the seam line of the cover. Then she'll pull out the pin prior to sewing. Next, we'll take that 3rd patch we haven't used yet and create a 1/4 inch hem around the perimeter, basting it with the double-sided tape. When we're done, we'll apply double-sided tape on top of the hem all around its perimeter. We'll then baste it to the outer surface of the cover, parallel to the seam, right over the spot we want to install the support pole. The 2-layer patch is underneath this on the underside. Now we'll take it to the sewing machine and sew around the outer perimeter. She'll leave her needle buried in the fabric, lift her foot, rotate the fabric, lower her foot, and continue to sew to the next corner, doing this all the way around and then reversing at the end. Here's what it looks like on the top side, and here's what it looks like on the bottom side. We have plenty of area to hit the bottom patches because they have not been hemmed. Support poles sold from Sailrite include a stud that goes through a grommet or a snap. Here we're installing a snap in this patch reinforcing area, and we'll snap the support pole at this location. These support poles will help from keeping water from pooling up in the center of the cover. Here Seth is snapping the support pole to the snap that we installed in the cover. Now, if you'd like to install a grommet instead and have the stud of the support pole go through that, we'll use a number 2 spur grommet. We're going to cut a hole in the center of our patch using a number 2 hole cutter available from Sailrite. And then we'll use the number 2 spur die set. Place the male portion of the grommet on the anvil. Place that male portion of the grommet through the hole in the cover. Then place the female portion of the grommet on top with the teeth facing down towards the fabric. Then we'll give it a few blows with the mallet to set the grommet in the canvas. Now we're ready to use a support pole with a stud. Here Seth is installing a support pole that has the stud going through the grommet. This powerboat cover is now complete and ready for use. She looks great and she's nice and snug all around. Be sure to check out the materials list coming up next. You'll find multiple choices of fabric that can be purchased from Sailrite. These are the materials we used to build this cover, and here are the tools that were also used to build the cover. For more free videos like this, be sure to check out the Sailrite website or subscribe to the Sailrite YouTube channel today. It's your loyal patronage to Sailrite that makes these free videos possible. Thanks for your support.